I wanted to talk about one of the things we hear about the media. Unlike in a dictatorial system, our media is diverse and varied. We have pluralistic media, a wide diversity of media. And in fact, there is a wide range. There's certainly a multiplicity of outlets. There are 15,000 radio stations. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of TV stations, affiliates, and take the non-affiliates and the locals. I mean, there are thousands of those altogether. There are many thousands of internet websites, blogger sites, hundreds of newspapers and magazines. In the wrong place, you suddenly realize, eh? All right. Well, but I would want to tender several caveats regarding all of this. First of all, a multiplicity of numbers does not necessarily mean diversity of viewpoints and information. The public discourse really is more often a chorus than it is a choir. More often a choir and a chorus than it is a cacophony. There isn't that much clash. Second, differences of opinions, when they're offered, and they are quite frequently in those talk shows and Sunday afternoon things, the differences of opinion usually occupy only a very limited range in the ideological spectrum. They go today, I would say, from far right to moderate right, with the one or two pale, nervous, slightly battered liberals who in there saying, oh, there isn't that much difference between us. Oh, they're always kissing up, dressing up to the right. You never see the right-wing guys do that to the other side. And that, by the way, is one of the methods of media manipulation I wrote about in one of the selections in Contrary Notions, one of the early articles. It's called false balancing. It gives you the impression of balance when it isn't. Third, even within that limited range, the presentations of differences are often heavily rigged on an uneven playing field. I was once on Crossfire, and that was back in the days when they still would have outspoken lefties occasionally. But so there's a diversity. Now there's a range, and I was on Crossfire twice. Once I was mugged by the Prince of Darkness, Robert Novak. But worse than him, actually I kind of like Novak. Worse than him, the guy I really detest is Fred Barnes. This thug from, he used to write for the New Republic. Now he's in some right-wing publication. And what they do is they just simply snap at you, and they yell at you, and they interrupt you, and you can't finish the sentence. And you ask, is this going to be a screaming match, or are you going to let me finish a sentence? And they say, you'll finish a sentence, but first we have to break for a commercial. And and then they never get back to you, and that's the way it goes. Another way they rig that playing field is by, in a lot of these debates, what you get is the person who gives the U.S. or White House perspective is an American. And the person who's critical of that White House perspective will be a Russian with a thick accent, whose English isn't maybe all that great, who really can't connect to what are the concerns of American opponents. That was true during the missile debates we used to have them. We're going to get two sides now. We're getting Dr. So-and-so, Elliot Abrams, and Ivan Koskavoshky from the Soviet embassy, But the debate wasn't, the debate about those missiles weren't between the Americans and the Russians. The Russians were trying to get a nuclear freeze. The debate on those missiles was between Americans and Americans, and they didn't have the other Americans on. They didn't have any articulate peace opponent to that missile escalation, you see. So they rigged the thing, and they do this often. And yet you're given the impression that there's a balance. You got two sides of a story. Another point is that on this appearance of diversity, the whole left portion of the political spectrum is amputated. The progressive, radical left with people like Peter Phillips and me and others, that's pretty much it cut out, amputated. I couldn't get on Crossfire anymore, by the way. It's moved so far right now, that whole thing. We're cut out of the discourse. And even when left progressive views do acquire a toehold in the whole media universe, it's really just that, a toehold. The outlets are few in number, small in range and output and circulation. They're rather marginalized, lacking the millions of dollars that are needed for promotion, for outreach, for breaking into mainstream markets. So we don't reach millions. We can reach thousands. We can reach tens of thousands, maybe even some hundreds of thousands. But that's it. The mass market, the millions, are commanded by those who have millions in their pocket. That's what we call the mainstream media. Now, who owns the big media? You must all know. I won't dwell too long on that. There are, I think it's down to 6 giant conglomerates that own all the major television outlets, radio stations, magazine and book publishing. And we know the names of the press lords: Hearst, Luce, Murdoch, Sulzberger, Annenberg, and the like. All of them of markedly conservative persuasion. And they leave their ideological imprint on both news and editorial content. Rupert Murdoch described himself once in an interview not as a conservative, he said, but a radical conservative. Now, radical conservative is really a euphemism for extreme conservative. He's saying, I'm not just your conservative, I'm really going for broke here. He was once also asked in an interview, you're considered to be politically conservative. To what extent do you influence the editorial posture of your newspapers? And he responded with refreshing candor. He said, considerably. And usually they say, oh, no, I respect the journalistic integrity and independence of the editors and all. He didn't say that. He didn't give us that blather. He said, considerably. My editors have input, but I make the final decisions. And when he bought the Wall Street Journal just recently, he said, I'm not paying you $5 billion not to have my opinions in there. I mean, he openly says that. The boards of directors of the print and broadcast mainstream news organizations are populated by representatives from Ford, General Motors, General Electric, Alcoa, Coca-Cola, Philip Morris, ITT, IBM, AT&T, and all sorts of other mainstream corporations. They all sit on the boards. Among the 3 major stockholders of the mainstream media are Chase Manhattan's, J.P. Morgan, and Citibank. All 3 are banks. And one could go on and on. The rate of merger in the media is more intensive than it is in most other areas of the American business community. The profits, despite the fact that they're always crying with a loaf of bread under their arm, as my Italian grandpa used to call it, crying with a loaf of bread under, I know, pretending poverty, in other words, their rate of profit is higher, is substantially higher than in manufacturing and other things like that. Inputs. One of the interest groups that are often advertised when they give any input into the political process is labor. One of the favorite descriptions, one of the favorite labeling is big labor, capital B, capital L. Big labor gave $25 million to political campaigns in 1996. That happens to be true. But do you know what they don't tell you is that business corporations spent more than $25 million in initiative campaigns in the state of Florida and the state of California, just for some initiatives to get on the ballot. Then labor spent all over America. So you don't hear that, you see. One study shows that worker issues all the reports that are dealing with worker issues, and they define worker issues rather broadly to include daycare and minimum wage. In 1 year, it came to just 2.3% of the total coverage of news reports in America, in the media. No wonder that another survey found that only 6% of business leaders thought that the media treatment of business was poor, whereas 66% said that it was excellent or good. You see, they get treated very well. Another group that has very influential input into molding and controlling the media is corporate advertisers. Not just corporate owners, but then paying the costs and giving the profits of this are your corporate advertisers, the guys who... so if you start a newspaper or a radio station and all that, you got to have some kind of income from it, and that only comes pretty much from the business community. And the record is that they will often cancel their accounts, not because of product disparagement, not because their particular product was shown poorly on the media, but for ideological reasons, that they will find that there's a little bit too much liberalish perspective seeping into the news reports, and so they will complain and either threaten to pull there or pull, it depends, if they can't get their way on things. So the listening public might like that kind of critical perspective, but they don't get it as much as they would want to. Another influence, a conservative and reactionary influence really, are the religious media. How many people here have heard of the Christian right? Everybody, right? Everybody's hand going up, thanks. How many have heard about the Christian left? Duh, the Christian left. Well, there happen to be tens of thousands of, including evangelicals, who are left, progressive, have a strong thing about Jesus is with the poor and in the streets, and to be a real person of God means to live for social justice and struggle and all that. You don't hear about it because they don't own these big multi-billion-dollar networks, which the Christian right, backed and financed by corporate America, by the most conservative and reactionary elements of corporate America, they don't own television stations and networks and radio stations. One of the favorite hallucinations of right-wing critics of the media is that NPR and PBS is a left-wing stronghold, in fact, according to a number of studies, more than 70% of PBS's primetime shows are funded wholly or in major part by the 4 major oil companies. In fact, the public broadcasting system, some people call it the petroleum broadcasting system, their public affairs programs are underwritten by, ready, General Electric, General Motors, Metropolitan Life, PepsiCo, Mobil, Paine Webber, et cetera, Exxon, of course, and like. One media watchdog group found that corporate representatives constitute 44% of the sources about the economy. Public interest activists account for only 3%. Labor representatives are virtually shut out. The guests on NPR and PBS generally are as ideologically conservative, imbalanced, or moderately palely liberal as anything found on commercial networks. The conservatives, you get the bulldogs like David Horowitz. He argues again and again that there are all these liberal documentaries that appear on PBS. In fact, most of the documentaries are pretty standard. Most of the perspective is really pretty uncritical of anything, and even downright conservative. Occasionally there are a few really outstanding, 2 I can think about, which won the Academy Award One of them was it was called Deadly Deception. It won an Academy Award. It was a film, documentary film. It got shown hardly anywhere on PBS. The other was a film, and the second one I tracked even more closely. It won an Academy Award too, because I was in it. I was one of the talking heads. That was Panama Deception. I was in a film that won an Academy Award. I should have held out for a bigger fee, Peter, I think. Come to think of it, I keep that in mind. Panama Deception did play on KQED one night, maybe twice, and in Boston once, and one or two other PBS outlets. That's all. Over the whole country, of all of them. They wouldn't. This is after it won an Academy Award too. So even where supposedly we are, right at the top of it, it's not so true. So despite the great multiplicity of media outlets, we don't have a diverse and widely varying range and scope of opinion. It is an orthodoxy for the most part. An orthodoxy with some political diversity around the fringes. The mainstream media do not only mold and control opinion as such, but they also control opinion visibility. Even more than controlling actual opinion, they control what is visible opinion, what people are going to see, and then what they're going to focus and start thinking about and bring their minds to. And if an opinion can't achieve visibility, it's in effect suppressed. It's of no account. It's divested of legitimacy. It's not ever likely to win a mass audience if it can't reach a mass audience. An audience, by the way, that might really benefit and might find it very interesting, these different alternative and heterodox opinions. Now, when you talk to journalists, when I wrote my book, Inventing Reality, 2 years before Manufacturing Consent was published, by the way, when I wrote that book, I thought this was going to be grand. Journalists were going to take this book and say, wow, this really opened my eyes. This is great. And I would get on a lot of panels with journalists, and they would be uncompromisingly angry and annoyed and say, how dare you say that? How dare you? Listen, I'll have you know, for 25 years I've been working on this newspaper, I always say what I like. And then I would respond, you can say what you like because your boss likes what you say. But if you go beyond a certain thing, you see, you don't feel there's a leash around your neck if you're sitting right by the peg that the leash is on. It's only when you start straying a little, but then you feel the tug, That's when the old man comes in and says, you're getting a little too close to the story. You've been giving too much time to this. This is going to cause a lot of stink with some of our advertisers and this and that. And I think you're overdoing, you're getting emotionally involved. What do you mean emotionally? I just found this out there. No, I think, let's drop it. Let's just drop it now. So you're not censored. It's Project Censored. We should have a section called Quiet Censored. It's just around the water cooler, Don't become a cause guy. You're losing your objectivity. Objectivity means you don't talk about things that are a little too tricky, you see, a little too heated or too hot. So to keep your objectivity, you dilute your reality that you're seeing. You don't get into subjects that really can kick up a lot of steam. A lot of that stuff then just splashes onto you, you see. And you hear reporters, they'll say, look, we're not perfect. You have deadlines. We get limited amounts of money to cover this, which is really true at times. You have to squeeze a complicated story into 800 words or 1,200 words or something, or 2,000 words. That would be a pretty good-sized story. There are all sorts of problems like that. So, and no communication system can hope to report everything. So therefore, selectivity is unavoidable. Now, of course, such problems do exist. It's true. But no communication can hope to report everything. That's true. The press must be selective. But the question is, what principle of selectivity is involved? Media bias usually doesn't occur in random fashion, but rather it moves in more or less consistent directions, favoring management over labor. I gave you some studies on that one, some statistics. Corporations over corporate critics, affluent whites over low-income minorities, officialdom over protesters, privatization and free market reforms over public sector development, U.S. dominance of much of the world over revolutionary or populist social change, and conservative commentators and columnists are favored over progressive or radical ones. The most common form of media manipulation is suppression by omission. Some people claim that the press is sensationalistic, intrusive. More common than the sensationalistic hype is the artful avoidance. Truly sensational stories, truly sensational, not sensationalistic about Brittany and Paris and all that stuff, but truly sensational stories tend to be downplayed or completely avoided, even ones of major import. Let's say the massacre of upwards of 1 million human beings in Indonesia back in 1968, was that? 65? 65, thank you. That wasn't even carried in the press. CIA directed and such, right? They destroyed Sukarno's government, all the parties that supported him. The libraries and clinics that the Communist Party had put up in Indonesia were destroyed along with the communists and all sorts of other people. That's a remarkably sensational story. It wasn't reported. We hear about political repression perpetrated by officially designated rogue nations, but information about the massacres and death squads perpetrated by U.S.-sponsored surrogate forces in countries all over Central America, South America, Africa, Asia, and such. You hear not a word, hardly a word. Much of this activity, by the way, was the object of extended congressional investigation by Senator Church's committee into what the CIA was doing, Congressman Pike's committee in the 1970s, Senator Kerry's committee in the late 80s about the cocaine shipments and what was happening in Central America and the slaughter and the murders and the crimes. The media gave them hardly any attention, except the controversies around them when Pike was getting kicked out of his chair. But they were just brushed aside as conspiracy theories and hysteria and the like. I'll give you an example of what was, for me, one of the most remarkable cases of suppression by omission. And that's the Saddam Hussein story. That what we've heard for the last 5 years, what we've heard since '91, really, is that Saddam Hussein is a cruel and oppressive dictator, and the U.S. was going to overthrow him and bring in democracy. And we were opposed to him because he was a dictator and because he was in bed with Al-Qaeda, which we find that latter part is false. Now, the truth is he was a cruel and oppressive dictator. What they always left out of all these stories, again and again and again, was the history of Saddam Hussein. They didn't go back. They only went from 1990. They didn't go back just, say, to 1958 and what followed after that. They didn't tell you that Saddam Hussein was created by the CIA, that his first gig, his first job, was to assassinate the prime minister of a democratically elected government in Iraq. They didn't tell you that Iraq had had a democratic revolution with a wide range and coalition of all sorts of people, progressives, communists, constitutionalists, Democrats, all these people. They didn't need to be taught democracy by a U.S. Army coming in 2003. They had a democracy, and that democracy was destroyed. He muffed his first job. He didn't kill the prime minister. He just wounded him, and he got hustled out of the country to Saudi Arabia, some safe house or someplace for a while. Later on, he came back, and he was backed. And that Saddam Hussein, when he took over power, he killed every single progressive and Democrat and leftist and whatever else, including the whole left wing of his own Ba'athist party. He assassinated them and murdered them. And during those years, when he was at his most bloodthirsty, murderous, torturous, during those years, he was Washington's poster boy. They couldn't do enough for him. They gave him money. They gave him guns. They gave him some bacterial weapons to use against Iran, didn't they? They did all that sort of thing. None of that's ever mentioned. I mean, it's just absolutely amnesia. There's an ideological amnesia there. And every reference to Saddam Hussein, all it was that the U.S. was standing up to this bad guy. Never any reference to the reality that the U.S. had created this bad guy. And they loved him. It's only when he got out of line on the oil quotas and wanted a larger oil quota, which George Bush Sr., and that was right in the Washington Post. I cited that in one of my books, I forget. I said, this is no secret, this is no conspiracy. Right there in the Washington Post, Iraqi oil comes in, that might really deflate prices and price on oil will go down. We can't let that happen. That's when they started having problems with him. And when he wouldn't privatize any of his economy and kept a state-run economy, which looked kind of socialistic, and actually kept some of the social programs of the very people he killed, that's when they had problems with him. Let me see. All right, here's another method of media manipulation. This is one you're all familiar with, and you're critical of it yourself. It's called labeling. You know what that is. Here's some positive labels. Stability, as opposed to instability. The president's firm leadership. Who wants wobbly presidential leadership? A strong defense. Do you want a weak defense? You see, it's just built in right there. A healthy economy. That's better than a sick economy. The label defines the subject without having to deal with particular actualities that might complicate your thoughts and lead to different conclusions. Here's some common negative labels. Leftist guerrillas, Islamic terrorists, conspiracy theory, inner city gangs, anti-American. Anti-American, that is applied by the right-wingers to anybody who criticizes White House policy. You're anti-American, you're criticizing America. So they try to equate your criticism of the actions of certain U.S. leaders take that as proof that you hate your country or you're something like that. Here are some labels that the major media never employ. Class power, class struggle, U.S. imperialism. You'll never hear those terms. Never. You can sit by your TV set day after day, hour after hour, waiting. One term you will hear quite frequently is class war. And it's used by the right whenever people on the left complain about how the super rich are getting away with no taxes, how the corporations their taxes are being lowered, how people down at the lower rungs of the ladder are getting, and the guys up there start saying, oh, you're just waging class war. You see, they're waging class war on our heads all the time, day and night. The minute we just sort of talk back and say, oh, you're waging class war, that sort of thing. Free market, free trade, those are other pet labels which I don't have time to go into all that. I'll talk about some of that later maybe. Face value transmissions and unexamined assumptions. Now that's a big one. Take, for instance, the discussion that has been going on for the last 20 years about Social Security. This is also the lack of filling in information and such, cutting in the middle of the story. What we have heard, it's more than 20, it's about 30 years now. About 30 years we've been hearing that Social Security is going to run out any year. 30 years ago, George Bush Jr., when he was running for Congress, said that Social Security is going to be absolutely bankrupt by 2003. Now, 30 years ago, 2003 seemed a long way off, you know. Social Security continues to produce billions of dollars of surplus every year. It has produced a $1.2 trillion surplus. Where did that money go, by the way? Bush Jr. doesn't say a word about where that money is. That money is taken and it's put in the regular budget and it's spent on missiles and FBI agents and everything like that. A minor hike in the program's, by the way, tax ceiling, which would affect just upper income earners, would take care of any increased demand when the baby boomers start to retire. And that point gets relatively little play. Most Americans, in fact, don't even know what Social Security is. Social Security is a three-pronged program. The one that everybody talks about is the pension and retirement, old age program. But there are two other prongs there. There's disability insurance. There are millions of people who would be out on the streets starving, suffering serious physical disabilities, who get a disability check every month. It's disgracefully low. It isn't enough to live on, but it manages, in some cases, it's the thing that allows some margin of survival. And the other prong to the Social Security program is survivor's insurance. Any child whose breadwinner is killed or dies or isn't there anymore, that child can get Social Security support until the age of 18. So that Social Security has been the most successful anti-poverty program we've had. It's beautifully administered. That's never pointed out. Its administrative costs are only 1%. They did a poll of Americans and they said, how much do you think it costs to administer the Social Security program? What percentage? And they said 20%, 30% must go to administration. 1%. And they never miss a check. It's much more efficient and much less expensive than all the private insurance companies. Let me tell you about this one, denying causality. That's a method of media manipulation, also known as stuff just happens. You don't ask why, you see. Many things are reported, but very few are explained. Little is said about how the social order is organized and for what purposes. Instead, we're left to see the world as the mainstream pundits do, as a scatter of events, personalities, propelled by happenstance, passing expediencies, confused intentions, bungled operations, private individual ambitions, and the like. Rarely is it a world influenced by powerful class interests. Recessions, for instance, apparently just happen like some natural phenomenon. Our economy is in a slump, having little to do with monetary policy and the contradictions between increased productivity and decreased buying power, having little to do with profiteering, with cornering markets and the like. Globalization is one of those things that the press presents as an inevitable and natural thing. In fact, globalization is a carefully premeditated policy pursued by transnational corporate interests throughout the world to gain an unchallengeable grip on markets and resources. Globalization really elevates the right of property above all other rights, environmental regulation, labor rights, whatever else. Those are all seen as interference with trade, loss of market opportunity, whatever else, and they can all be wiped out. And so it actually has primacy over democratic sovereignty. The people can vote for regulation to ban a certain, say, chemical additive in a product, and some other country can say this is interference of trade, and the lost market opportunity. This cuts into my profits, and you can't do it. World Trade Organization says they're right, can't do it. So what they've done is taken a group of people who are elected by nobody, accountable to nobody, with no conflict of interest restrictions put on them, and they are passing these globalization, free trade treaty decisions that override national governments. Now, it's not that I'm so unhappy to see a national government. I'm not a nationalist, get overridden. It's that government was responding to democratic voices. And these guys are making decisions that had nothing to do with that democratic public that had made the original decision. Social problems in the media are rarely associated with the political economic forces that create them. Let me give you an example. We're taught by example almost never to ask why things happen. Let's take this. Supposing we report that there are harsh labor conditions in so many countries. Very little attention is given to that. Very few reports are given. But supposing we make that report. But then supposing we do something else. Supposing we cross a line and we say, and those harsh labor conditions are due to military oppression and the military control. They have the interests that impose those conditions have the backing of the military in these various countries. Now that's an extraordinary thing. Now you're actually making a criticism about the military, and you're given some explanation as to why such conditions prevail. They got guns backing them. They've got the ultimate authority of organized violence. Now suppose further we cross another line, and we note that these military forces are fully supported and funded by the U.S. national security state. Whoa. Well, they don't say that. No one's rarely going to report that. Now you've really crossed another line. And then suppose we cross that most serious line of all, and instead of just deploring this fact and saying it's terrible that our own government is backing some of the most reactionary countries in the world, instead of just having that indignant denunciation, suppose we conclude, we cross another line and we ask why. Why have successive U.S. administrations involved themselves in such pursuits throughout the world? Suppose we conclude that the whole phenomenon is consistent with a dedication to making the world safe for free market transnational corporate capitalism, as measured by the kinds of countries that are helped and the kinds of countries that are attacked. Such an analysis would really go all the way. And almost certainly, such an analysis would receive no circulation except maybe in a few select radical publications. We just crossed too many lines. We went beyond the parameters of permissible discourse. Because we tried to explain a particular situation, bad labor conditions, in terms of a larger set of social relations, transnational corporate power, our presentation would be rejected out of hand as conspiracy theory or paranoid or cynical or Marxist or some other negative label that puts a foreclosure on argument and evidence and critical thinking. In other words, the media's daily performance under what is called democratic capitalism is not a failure, but a skillfully evasive success. We often hear that the press got it wrong or dropped the ball on this story or that. In fact, the media do their job quite well. Media people have a trained incapacity for the whole truth. That's Thorsten Veblen's term, trained incapacity. It's not that these people are so stupid, but they're just trained in a certain way. And you could even say that about some doctors and professors and military strategists and such. They've been trained a certain way. The whole military commands in all the armies of World War I, right? They're trained. Just send the troops out like this to get hosed down by machine guns. Kill, kill, kill. The whole idea of attack was a massed frontal assault. It just never occurred to them that there's a different way to do it, you know. Segments covering other segments, one running to a post, going down, another one coming up, and the like. So the only way you can explain it is not that they're stupid. Well, yeah, they're stupid, I guess, but they also have a trained incapacity. Their perceptions have been so channelized that they can't get out of that. Well, let me end by just recalling Upton Sinclair's remark. It's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. Journalists and editors who want to keep their careers afloat learn the fine art of evasion and suppression and censorship. We should not accuse them of doing a poor or sloppy job of reporting. If anything, with much finesse, they skirt around the most important points of a story, saying a lot about very little, serving up heaps of junk news, so many empty calories, so few nutrients. Thus do they avoid offending those who wield political economic power while giving an appearance of judicious moderation and balance. So what we have to do is become aware of the deliberate and intentional elements of our oppression. We are less likely to dismiss our leaders as stupid and misguided failures when we see how they serve their own interests so well. They're succeeding quite well in shaping and monopolizing the dominant ideology and the universe of discourse. We need to learn to deal not only with issues, but with ideology. We need to do more than help the poor. We need to ask why there are so many poor and what are the social forces that create poverty. We need not only to condemn the war, we need to ask why that war is being pursued. Cui bono? What interests benefit from it? Then we move from a liberal complaint about how bad things are to a radical analysis of why they are the way they are and how they can be changed. And by not listening to the Democratic Convention this evening and coming to hear me instead, you've taken a small step in that direction. Thank you. There are times when, short of revolution, the threat of revolution causes the ruling interest to make concessions. They give a little in order to keep a lot. The whole example of the Soviet Union and the communist countries where workers had complete security of jobs, they had 50% pensions, retirements at age 55, 60, 55 if you're a woman, 60 if you're a man, guaranteed right to education, medical care, this, that, affordable housing, so forth. That often caused concessions in Western Europe. The whole emergence of social democracy in Western Europe was really saying, hey, you don't have to go communist, you stay with us. And the presence of large communist parties in those parliaments pushing for these things, taking not a revolutionary course, but a reformist course. No matter what Togliatti said, when the Italian Communist Party was in parliament, they were not pursuing a revolution. They were calling for protection for labor seniority and for, better wages, so forth, so on. So their gains have been made And those are very real gains. They should not be just dismissed as just sops, which the ruling class cleverly just tossed little crumbs off the table. That's not crumbs off the table. When you can get a living wage, where you used to have child labor working here 14 hours a day, 10-year-olds, 6 and 7 days a week, and you get that changed to an 8-hour day and a living wage for 8 hours. I mean, that's really cutting into profits and the like. They, meaning the capitalist class, never thought of those struggles as minor or dilatory or deflecting or inconsequential. They took all of those things seriously, just like they take every election seriously. They take every election so serious that they give money to both candidates. Why own one party when you can own two? Or a good chunk of the second party. Maybe not. You don't own it as completely as the first. And in fact, the first party may be causing such problems in forgetting it. The second function of the bourgeois state, which is not to maximize profits and advance profits, and protect the corporate investment and such. That's the main key function of the bourgeois state. But there's a second function that the state has. It's not just to advance and see that capital accumulation prospers. The second function is to keep the capitalists from devouring the capitalist system itself. It's a self-devouring beast. They'll go at it and eat themselves alive. They'll plunder themselves. We saw that in Brazil, Chile. Worst of all, where? Dramatically. Argentina. Remember that? In the 90s. Every single industry of the whole financial structure was just plundered. These guys just walked away with millions and millions of dollars until the whole thing collapsed. That was the failure of the bourgeois state to protect the capitalist system from particular capitalist marauders. We saw that in the United States back in 2000, 2001, 2, right? Harkin, WorldCom, Enron, Adelphia, John Regas. John Regas went to jail. Ken Lay almost went to jail. He died. Fastra went to jail. What were they doing? They were saying, hey, I got a great idea. Instead of worrying about making refrigerators, you got to buy things, you got to buy resources, you got to pay for them, you've got to deal with labor, you got to produce them, you got to market them, you got to hope for sales and all that. Instead of doing all that to make money, let's just go after money. Let's just go and do insider trading and jack up the value of the stock and put the stock in the hands of our employees and tell them they've got to buy it and this and that at these prices. We sell it, walk away with millions, and then they realize this is worthless paper and it all collapses. Enron was a viable corporation that had employed 5,000 people. It was their livelihood. It got wiped out. It got just wiped out by Ken Lay stealing from it. So how did I get into all of that? But it was about this class. I mean, these guys play for real. They'll destroy their lives. They'll destroy the environment. They'll destroy anything. We are facing something that still may be a meltdown. It might go down because when you have these enormous debts, what it means is everything's worthless. Everything, you got nothing backing up anything. You got a trade debt that's enormous. China has right now about 490 billion U.S. dollars. They don't want any more dollars. They want to get paid in euros. They want to get paid. They'll even take yen. Japan has even more than that. Japan has even more than China. Fidel Castro predicted this years ago. He said someday the world's going to wake up and realize that there's one country printing all these paper dollars. There's nothing backing it. I mean, they're not backing it in the sense they're not selling their stuff as good. They're bringing it all in and just giving you paper for it. But there's such a mystique about America, prosperous America, and all that. Everybody thought this is it. It's really no longer the reserve currency. That was one of the reasons why Saddam Hussein was attacked, because he got off the dollar. He no longer had the dollar as his reserve currency. You can't blame him. You're bombing him. You invaded. You killed so many of his people in 90 and 91. He got off the dollar and he made the euro his reserve currency. And when a big oil country does that, that has even more of a spin-off effect. So we are facing something very catastrophic. And besides that trade debt, you have a national debt. That's what you were referring to. And you got consumer and creditor debts. You got student debts. You got all sorts of debt. It's just amazing. And so you can't just keep living on nothing and living at a certain level. And when that comes down, when that crashes, it's us at the lower rungs that are going to get the crunch of it. So on Georgia, to answer that person's question, there's a perfect example of the amputation of the story, starting in the middle and just throwing the rest out to oblivion. Georgia attacked South Ossetia, August 7th. They attacked massively with missiles and bombs. They killed several hundred people. They destroyed homes and hospitals and schools and libraries and bridges and this and that. They wrecked a good chunk of the provincial capital, and they killed about 16 Soviet soldiers who were in there as, quote, peacekeepers with the Georgians. The Georgians pulled back when that happened. Nobody talks about that. All we hear of is the Russian aggression. I mean, you got to really find that rather remarkable, how that whole thing that happened on August 7th, the president of Georgia, Saakashvili, he himself has said, yes, we were the first we fired the first shot. That sounds like a nervous sentry, shoots over the barricade. Fired the first shot. They went in there and blasted them. And now they got hit back when the Russian army came at them. So what you have are people, especially liberals. Liberals are jumping up and down on this war, denouncing the Russians for their aggression and this and that. The Russians have pretty much pulled out of most of the Georgian areas that they had moved into. They've pulled out now, but they are backing out of South Ossetia and what's the other one? Abkhazia. What? Abkhazia. Yeah. Yes, miss.
What are your thoughts about news from other countries, as in being at different ways to look at things? Do you think that that's more able to give more perspective? That's a little bit better than what we get from our own media?
I think you just said it, a little bit better than, yeah. The BBC is a little bit better. Their announcers are trained to be confrontational. And, they will ask confrontational questions, which you almost never hear from American journalists. And they'll say, well, you say this, but on the other hand, why did you also, they'll get right into direct argument all the time, a lot of time. But they, too, just go so far. They don't go much farther than that. And they're much better in the sense that you get a lot of world news from them. World news really is world news. In America, world news is what America's doing abroad here or there. It's like covering the Olympics. The Olympics are about how the U.S. competitors are doing here or there, not about what the sports people are. Yeah. It's you. Yeah.
Just out of curiosity, what do you think about the notion that our society might be headed toward a fusion of Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and
A fusion of...
Say, a fusion of Huxley's Brave New World, where we have entertainment, to distract everyone, and then Orwell's 1984, we have the police state. Do you think we might be headed in that kind of direction?
Well, yeah, I mean, there are those trends and those things happening. Those are works of fiction. But I always thought that Huxley's description of it was much better than Orwell's. Orwell's relied on terror. Winston Smith stood there and the TV talked back at him and said, touch your toes, Winston, and get down, and that kind of micromanaging and all that. That's really not necessary. Huxley was much better. He said you would use this other kind of stuff, this puffery, this distraction, this empty feel-good kind of way of disarming your populations with a lot of old-fashioned terror and intimidation. Those of us who've been beaten up and arrested by the powers that be in anti-war movements and such years ago. I can tell you that the hard stuff is there, plenty of it. They have concentration camps set up, as you know. They've had them for years to round up dissidents. There are people who, in Homeland Security and other areas and such, who are waiting for the call, waiting for the bell to ring. Let's just take one more question, okay?
I agree with about everything you're saying in the overall picture, which is why the exceptions kind of intrigue me. And I'm wondering what you make of what's going on at MSNBC, because NBC, NBC, which I believe is owned by General Electric, which is like the #2 or #3 defense contractor in the country.
And a very conservative NBC, a very conservative right-wing political culture in General Electric for years. They're the ones who brought Ronnie Reagan, out of poverty and brought him back up and put him into the General Electric theater and all that sort of thing.
My question is, what do you make of the fact that they're now sponsoring Keith Olbermann and they just hired Rachel Maddow, who, whatever issues you may have with them, I think have to be admitted to be left of center.
Yeah, Keith Olbermann is good. I like to watch him. He hates the same people I hate, and he talks about O'Reilly, you disgusting creepo, and all that. And I say, don't hold back, Keith. Don't hold back. So keep going. They have such a preponderance and they don't have to have absolute control, just a preponderance of control, just an overwhelming control. And all that does is adds to the legitimation that it is a varied and open system. There are varieties of opinion and such. So Hannity has Combs. What?
Exposed in the Church Senate Committee hearings in '76.
The CIA in the media. Yeah, I didn't get into that, but yeah. But the CIA, we found, had hundreds of journalists planted all over the place. They had agents who were pretending to be journalists, and they had journalists who were recruited and working as agents while they also were journalists. Yeah, that's another whole story. I didn't get into that. Right. Well, thank you. You've been a very kind audience. Those who have millions in their pocket. That's what we call the mainstream media. Now, who owns the big media? You must all know. I won't dwell too long on that. There are, I think it's down to 6 giant conglomerates that own all the major television outlets, radio stations, magazine and book publishing. And we know the names of the press lords: Hearst, Luce, Murdoch, Sulzberger, Annenberg, and the like. All of them of markedly conservative persuasion. And they leave their ideological imprint on both news and editorial content. Rupert Murdoch described himself once in an interview not as a conservative, he said, but a radical conservative. Now, radical conservative is really a euphemism for extreme conservative. He's saying, I'm not just your conservative, I'm really going for broke here. He was once also asked in an interview, "You're considered to be politically conservative. To what extent do you influence the editorial posture of your newspapers?" And he responded with refreshing candor. He said, "Considerably." And usually they say, "Oh, no, I respect the journalistic integrity and independence of the editors." And all. He didn't say that. He didn't give us that blather. He said, "Considerably. My editors have input, but I make the final decisions." And when he bought the Wall Street Journal just recently, he said, "I'm not paying you $5 billion not to have my opinions in there." I mean, he openly says that. The boards of directors of the print and broadcast mainstream news organizations are populated by representatives from Ford, General Motors, General Electric, Alcoa, Coca-Cola, Philip Morris, ITT, IBM, all that great, who really can't connect to what are the concerns of American opponents. That was true during the missile debates. We used to have them. We're going to get two sides now. We're getting Dr. So-and-so, Elliot Abrams, and Ivan Koskavoshky from the Soviet embassy. Who, you know, but the debate wasn't. The debate about those missiles weren't between the Americans and the Russians. The Russians were trying to get a nuclear freeze. The debate on those missiles was between Americans and Americans, and they didn't have the other Americans on. They didn't have any articulate peace opponent to that missile escalation, you see. So they rigged the thing, and they do this often. And yet you're given the impression that there's a balance. You got two sides of a story. Another point is that on this appearance of diversity, the whole left portion of the political spectrum is amputated. The progressive, radical left with people like Peter Phillips and me and others, that's pretty much amputated. It's cut out, amputated. I couldn't get on Crossfire anymore, by the way. It's moved so far right now, that whole thing. We're cut out of the discourse. And even when left progressive views do acquire a toehold in the whole media universe, it's really just that, a toehold. The outlets are few in number, small in range and output and circulation. They're rather marginalized, lacking the millions of dollars that are needed for promotion, for outreach, for breaking into mainstream markets. So we don't reach millions. We can reach thousands. We can reach tens of thousands, maybe even some hundreds of thousands. But that's it. The mass market, the millions, are commanded by those. I wanted to talk about one of the things we hear about the media. Unlike in a dictatorial system, our media is diverse and varied. We have pluralistic media, a wide diversity of media. And in fact, there is a wide range. There's certainly a multiplicity of outlets. There are 15,000 radio stations. There are hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of TV stations, affiliates, and take the non-affiliates and the locals. I mean, there are thousands of those altogether. There are many thousands of internet websites, blogger sites, hundreds of newspapers and magazines. In the wrong place, you suddenly realize, eh? All right. Well, but I would want to tender several caveats regarding all of this. First of all, a multiplicity of numbers does not necessarily mean diversity of viewpoints and information. The public discourse really is more often a chorus than it is a choir. I mean, more often a choir and a chorus than it is a cacophony. There isn't that much clash. Second, differences of opinions when they're offered, and they are quite frequently in those talk shows and Sunday afternoon things. The differences of opinion usually occupy only a very limited range in the ideological spectrum. They AT&T and all sorts of other mainstream corporations, they all sit on the boards. Among the three major stockholders of the mainstream media are Chase Manhattan's, J.P. Morgan, and Citibank. All three are banks. And one could go on and on. The rate of merger in the media is more intensive than it is in most other areas of the American business community. The profits, despite the fact that they're always crying with a loaf of bread under their arm, as my Italian grandpa used to call it, crying with a loaf of bread under your arm, pretending poverty, in other words, their rate of profit is higher, is substantially higher than in manufacturing and other things like that. Inputs. One of the interest groups that are often advertised when they give any input into the political process is labor. One of the favorite descriptions, one of the favorite labeling is big labor, capital B, capital L. Big labor gave $25 million to political campaigns in 1996. That happens to be true. But do you know what they don't tell you is that business corporations spent more than $25 million in initiative campaigns in the state of Florida and the state of California, just for some initiatives to get on the ballot, than labor spent all over America. So you don't hear that, you see. One study shows that worker issues, all the reports that are dealing with worker issues, and they define worker issues rather broadly to include daycare and minimum wage. In 1 year, it came to just today, I would say, from far right to moderate right, with the one or two pale, nervous, slightly battered liberals who in there saying, oh, there isn't that much difference between us. Oh, they're always kissing up, dressing up to the right, You never see the right-wing guys do that to the other side. And that, by the way, is one of the methods of media manipulation I wrote about in one of the selections in Contrary Notions, one of the early articles. It's called false balancing. It gives you the impression of balance when it isn't. Third, even within that limited range, the presentations of differences are often heavily rigged on an uneven playing field. I was once on Crossfire, and that was back in the days when they still would have outspoken lefties occasionally. But so there's a diversity. Now there's a range, and I was on Crossfire twice. Once I was mugged by the Prince of Darkness, Robert Novak. But worse than him, actually I kind of like Novak. Worse than him, the guy I really detest is Fred Barnes. This thug from, he used to write for the New Republic. Now he's in some right-wing publication. And what they do is they just simply snap at you, and they yell at you, and they interrupt you, and you can't finish the sentence. And you ask, is this going to be a screaming match, or are you going to let me finish a sentence? And they say, you'll finish a sentence, but first we have to break for a commercial. And, and then, they never get back to you, and that's the way it goes. Another way they rig that playing field is by, in a lot of these debates, what you get is the person who gives the U.S. or White House perspective is an American. And the person who's critical of that White House perspective will be a Russian with a thick accent whose English isn't maybe